Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here, presenting another Passage to Adventure for you, this one from 168 years ago. We're in the fall of 1848, and Robert Fortune is slowly making his way to the green tea districts of Huizhou. This is in the Huangshan region of Anhui province. Huangshan, of course, the famous mountain in China known for its unrivaled beauty and gorgeous granite peaks. It's one of China's great tourist attractions and the inspiration for countless poems and landscape paintings going back to the earliest days of imperial China. Our favorite snooty imperialist, Robert Fortune, is fetching all the way en route to their destination about his servant Wang. He's been traveling with two hired men. One is this Wang, who was local to the area known as Sun Lo Mountain, a legendary region of tea cultivation that wasn't what it used to be. The other person in this trio he simply refers to as the coolie, a man older than Wang. They travel by riverboat in a westerly direction. Today their route is maybe a 4.5-hour drive, but in 1848, without the convenience of the G56 highway, it took weeks. Fortune notes several places along the way to Huizhou. There's Twinshi, Xiuning, Ningbo, and Yanzhou, to name a few. Not what you call well-known locales. Twinshi is a tourist town that today, and I suppose back in Fortune's time as well, served as a kind of gateway to the Huangshan area. More notable cities also mentioned include Shaoxing. Fortune mentions that he had heard this city in Zhejiang was famous for all the literati it had spawned. And he didn't hear wrong. Wang Shizhi, for example, featured in CHP episode 96, was one of the more famous Shaoxingren, people from Shaoxing. Premier Zhou Enlai, also featured in a CHP 8-part series, considered himself a son of this town as well, even though he wasn't actually born there. His people came from there. RF also mentions in this passage the cities of Yuyao and, of course, his second home by now of Ningbo. He often mentions coming up on the ramparts of the city. A rampart is the wall that surrounds most of these Chinese cities. The width of these ramparts was sufficient enough to station troops and defensive weapons. Up until men figured out how to breach these city walls or blow them up, that was how city dwellers defended themselves against invading enemies. Fortune got to see a lot of these old city walls before they were destroyed in the chaos of the 1800s and 1900s. Some of them were so ancient that they had simply eroded away over the centuries. So, let's get on with today's passage. I gotta hand it to Fortune. That took a lot of guts to do what he did. It would be hard enough today to repeat his feat in the manner he did, but leaving the safety and security of the treaty ports and wandering into the interior, which was off limits to the likes of Fortune, was a terribly risky and adventurous thing to do. Anyways, let's get on with RF and his continuing adventure, this one in the employ of the British East India Company. We're reading from the book published in 1852 called Journey to the Tea Countries of China, including Songlo and the Bohei Hills. And this was published in 1852. On the evening of the 31st of October, we reached Weiping. It is a city of considerable size, walled and fortified, and probably contains 150,000 inhabitants. This place is just on the borders of the district of Huizhou. The dispute between Wang and the boatmen had not been forgotten, and the latter considered this a fitting time to have his revenge. During the last 2 days, he had been hinting to some of the passengers that he intended doing something at Weiping. These men duly reported to Wang what had been told them, and he began to be very much frightened. The rest of the Chinamen, with whom he was no favorite, seemed to enjoy his fears and did everything in their power to exaggerate the dangers to which he had exposed himself. He had had several disputes with them also during the journey, and nearly the whole of them bore him a grudge. Things were in this very unsatisfactory state when we reached the city of Weiping. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening and quite dark when we moored our boat close under the city walls. The boatmen went on shore, as they did every evening when we happened to stop near a town. One or two of their number, who had been left to take care of the boat, tired with the labors of the day, lay down to sleep, and the greater part of the passengers followed their example. I now observed my two men in close conversation, but as this was a matter of frequent occurrence, I paid little attention to the matter. Tired with my day's rambles, I lay down upon my bed and allowed my thoughts to wander to far distant lands. My meditations were gradually merging into dreams when I felt a hand touch me and a voice which I knew to be Wang's informed me that I must not go to sleep. When I asked the reason, he informed me that he had just discovered that the boatmen had entered into a conspiracy against us, and that we were all to be drowned that night in the river. They have gone into the town to get some of their friends to assist them, said he, and they are only waiting until they think we are fast asleep. I scarcely knew what to think of the business. We were now about 300 miles from either Shanghai or Ningbo. The night was very dark, and if the threatened attempt should be made, we had little chance of receiving any assistance from others. But I could not allow myself to believe that in the interior of this country, where the people were generally quiet and harmless, an act of the kind could be committed with impunity. I therefore did not get up as Wang wished, but told him that I should take care to remain awake. The city of Weiping stands on the high banks of the Huizhou River. One of the gates was visible to us, owing to a blaze of light thrown over it by the torches and lanterns of the Chinese. An inclined plane, which formed the road, reached from the river up to the gate and was visible from the boat. As all the Chinese carried lanterns, it was easy for us to see those who came out of the city and descended towards the river. The evening, although dark, was perfectly still, so that the slightest noise could be distinctly heard at a considerable distance. At last, the city gate opened, and about a dozen men came out, each carrying a lantern, and descended the hill towards the boat. Get up! Quick, quick!" said my servant, "for here they come." I jumped up immediately and waited for the threatened attack with all the composure I could command. My two Chinamen appeared in a state of great alarm and kept as close to me as they possibly could. At last, the foremost man in the band approached and, jumping lightly on board, peeped in at the door of our boat. "Hello! What do you want?" cried both of my men at the same time. The fellow gave a grin, said he did not want us, and jumped from our boat to another which lay alongside. His companions also disappeared amongst the surrounding boats and left us unmolested. "Now, do you see that?" said Wang. "You would not believe me when I told you that they intended to seize and drown us. But had we not been awake and fully prepared, it would soon have been all over with us." I must confess I felt a little shaken in my opinion and scarcely knew what to think of the business. The whole scene, to a looker-on who could have foreseen the result, would have been highly amusing, but it appeared to be much too serious for me to enjoy it. None of the other passengers were asleep, although they were all in bed, and they kept up a whispering conversation, which seemed ominous and suspicious. I felt quite certain that no assistance would be rendered us by them. On the contrary, it was not impossible that they would turn against us and assist the boatmen. About half an hour after the first alarm, the city gate was again opened, and some men were observed coming down the hill with lanterns, as the former ones had done. This time it proved to be the missing boatmen, who were supposed to be concocting a conspiracy with their friends inside the city. When they came on board and tried to look astonished at the state in which they found us, they laughed at Wang and said they had no intention of drowning him. He quietly told them that he did not believe them, and, turning to me, said he was sure that they still meditated an attack. The fellows now lay down to sleep and requested us to put out our lantern and do the same. This, however, my servants would not consent to do, as they firmly believed that the sleep of the boatmen was only feigned. We were in this state of excitement from 8 o'clock in the evening until 3 next morning. Long before this time, the boatmen seemed to be sound asleep. The night was perfectly calm, and the only sound which I heard was the clank of water wheels, similar to those of the machines I have already described, several of which were moored on the rapids opposite the city. The walls and ramparts of the old town loomed black and prison-like in the darkness, but everything was perfectly quiet, and the whole place seemed sunk in deep sleep. I felt very much inclined to go to sleep myself. This, however, my men remonstrated against, and I was obliged to keep them company for another hour longer. At the end of that time, nothing having happened to keep up the excitement, I felt cold and sleepy, so much so that no persuasion could keep me awake. Telling Wang to call me if anything suspicious occurred, I lay down without undressing, and was soon dreaming of robbers, boatmen, and water wheels. When I awoke, I found that it was daylight and that we were under way and proceeding rapidly up the stream. 15 of our men were on shore tracking the boat. The cook was busily employed making preparation for our morning meal, and everything was going on in the usual way, as if nothing had happened to disturb us. My own men, wearied with watching, had fallen into a sound sleep and were stretched at full length on the floor of the boat. As the other passengers were also sleeping soundly, I had a little time to think quietly over the events of the preceding night, and being anxious to see the old town by daylight, I stepped out of the cabin and took my place on the high stern of the boat, near to the old man who stood at the helm. The sun was just rising, and its earliest rays were playing upon the old walls and watchtowers of Waiping. How different the old place looked in daylight from what it had done in the darkness. Then the imagination assisted in making it appear like a dungeon, dark and gloomy, and inhabited by thieves and robbers. Now it seemed an ancient city, watered by a clear and beautiful river, surrounded by hills and romantic scenery, and defended by time-honored walls. Such is the difference between night and morning, and such the power of imagination. When I returned to the cabin, I found my servants rubbing their eyes and scarcely awake. "Well," said I, "you see nothing has happened, and we are now under way and some distance from Waiping." "Oh, that is all very well," said one of them, "but had we not been on guard, we should never have lived to see the morning." As the river was now shallow and in many parts very rapid, I had daily opportunities of rambling over the country and of inspecting its productions. Soon after leaving Waiping, one of my guides informed me that we were now on the border of another province, and that here I had better not go much out of the boat. I found that this advice was good and worth attending to. The river here is considered the highway or passage from the one district to the other, and this pass is well guarded by soldiers. Each province has its own guard town. On the Zhejiang side, we passed a long, straggling town on the river's banks, chiefly inhabited by troops who were the guards of the pass and under the orders of the Hangzhou mandarins. As soon as the boundary line was crossed, we came to another place of like size and appearance, also filled with soldiers who were under the orders of the authorities of Huizhou in the province of Jiangnan. These two parties formed a sort of border guard and bore each other, I believe, little goodwill. They reminded me of our own border clans in ancient feudal times. Boats passing up and down the river were generally boarded and had their papers examined by one of the officers. The boatman who had the dispute with Wang now threatened to have him punished here, at which he was greatly frightened. The man, however, if he ever intended it, did not put this threat into execution, and we passed the dreaded border in safety. When we got fairly inside the Huizhou district, I was able to ramble about in the country as before. The river became not only shallow, but in many parts so full of rocks and stones that it was next to impossible to pick out a passage for the boat. It still wound through a hilly and mountainous country. The hills, however, became gradually more fertile as we proceeded, and in many parts they were cultivated to their summits. Crops of millet and Indian corn were growing amongst the tea bushes, which were now observed in large quantities on the sides of the hills. The corn and millet, growing up in the hot months of summer and autumn, seemed to afford a partial shade to the tea, which was probably beneficial to it. Another reason for the practice may be found in the fondness of the Chinese for mixing crops, a practice in operation all over the country. I never saw finer crops of millet and Indian corn than those which were growing on these hills. The crops were just ripening, being November 2nd, and the Chinese had begun to harvest them. In walking over the country, I always, when possible, avoided entering large towns. About this time, however, all the passengers were obliged to get out of the boat in order to lighten it and allow it to be drawn up one of the shallow rapids. We all walked on together, and in a short time came to a town of considerable size. It happened that the day we arrived was a holiday, and a scene presented itself such as I had never before witnessed. The town was on the opposite bank. Two rivers unite here, and the town was built between them just at their junction. One of the rivers was nearly dry, and its bed was now used for the purpose of giving a grand fete. The bank where we were was probably about 150 or 200 feet above the bed of the river, so that we had a capital view of what was going on below us. The first and most prominent object which caught my eye was a fine 7-storied pagoda, 40 or 50 feet high, standing on the dry bed of the river. Near to it was a summer house upon a small scale, gaudily got up and supposed to be in a beautiful garden. Artificial figures of men and women appeared sitting in the verandas and balconies, dressed in the richest costumes. Singing birds were whistling about the windows. Artificial lakes were formed in the bed of the river, and the favored nelumbium appeared floating on the water. Everything denoted that the place belonged to a person of high rank and wealth. At some little distance, a theater was erected, in front of which stood several thousands of natives, packed as closely as possible, and evidently highly interested in a play which was going on. Sometimes the piece appeared so pathetic that the immense multitude were perfectly still. At other times, something seemed to tickle their fancies, and to afford them the greatest amusement. The actors on the stage were very gaily dressed in rich silks and satins of many colors, and evidently did their best to afford amusement to this immense audience. Such was the scene presented to us as we approached the town. "Come," said all my fellow passengers, "come and see the play," and they set off as fast as they could to a bridge a little higher up the river, by which they could reach the town and the place where the festivities were going on. I was quite satisfied with the view I had of the whole scene from the opposite bank, and therefore declined the invitation to go nearer. The old dwarf, whom I had already mentioned, and who had taken every opportunity in his power to show his good will, volunteered to remain with me and my 2 servants. We sat down on the green grass and had an excellent view of the whole proceedings. The Chinese never seemed to tire, and would have remained there all day. But as our boat would pass up the other branch of the river, it was necessary for us to get to it. We therefore crossed the bridge and passed through the center of the town. No one seemed to have the slightest idea that I was a foreigner. Indeed, the poor old dwarf attracted far more attention than any of us. I did not remark anything of interest in this town except some large tea hongs and carpenters' shops where tea chests were being made. When we had passed through the place and reached the other branch of the river, we entered a ferry boat and crossed over to the other side. Amongst the ferry boat passengers were 2 very pretty and handsomely dressed young ladies with whom I was greatly amused. When they came into the boat, they seated themselves quietly by my side and began chatting to each other in high spirits. I could not help contrasting their conduct with that of any of their countrywomen at the 5 ports where foreigners are permitted to trade. Respectably dressed females always fly from foreigners as they would do from any wild and ferocious animal. Had these pretty damsels known that a barbarian was seated at their side, how astonished and frightened they would have been. About evening, just before dark, the boat arrived and lay abreast of the town during the night. All the men now applied for leave to go on shore to see the play. Some of them appeared very anxious that I should go with them, but, being quite contented with the adventures of the day, I declined the invitation. It was very late before they all came back, but this did not prevent us from getting under way at the usual time next morning and proceeding on our journey. After we had gone some distance, the head boatman came round and informed the passengers that it would be necessary to engage another boat to take part of his cargo, as the river was too shallow to allow him to get up so deeply laden as he was. Moreover, he coolly proposed that the expenses of the second boat should be defrayed by the passengers, given as his reason that by this means they would get sooner to their destination. As the sum was not a large one, this was agreed to and a second boat was engaged. A circumstance now occurred which astonished me not a little at the time, although it must be a common thing in the country. When the second boat was brought alongside and the floor of our cabin taken up to get at the cargo, I found that we had some fellow passengers which I had never calculated upon. 2 enormous coffins, each containing the body of a Chinaman, had been lying directly under my bed for the last 3 weeks without my having the least suspicion of the fact. It was perhaps just as well that this was the case, for the knowledge of the circumstance would not have added to my comfort, and might have made me sleep less soundly. These coffins were now removed to the other boat, in which they were taken onwards to their last resting place. On inquiring, I found that the deceased were natives of Huizhou and had left their native country some years before to reside at Hangzhou, where they had died. Their friends were now taking their remains back to their own land to be buried in the graves of their ancestors. I had greatly been annoyed at the cowardice and fear of Wang. He had still the most serious apprehensions for his safety, as his enemy, the boatman, continued to threaten him. I tried to laugh at him and convince him that the boatman would do him no harm, but it was of no use. At last he came to me and explained a plan which he had been concocting and which he proposed putting into execution next day. It was simply this. He and I were to leave the boat, ostensibly to walk in the country as usual, but with the intention of not returning to it. I asked him what was to be done with our beds and luggage, and what he proposed doing with the other man. He proposed that all must be left behind, that if he attempted to leave the boat openly, measures would be taken to stop him, and that, as the coolie could not be trusted, he must be left also. He did not intend even to pay what was due upon our passage money. Such was the plan which, after days and nights of deep thought, as he told me, he had at last made up his mind to put into execution, and to which he now begged that I would agree. I thought over the business for some minutes, and then came to the determination not to adopt his suggestions. I was unwilling to leave behind me the seeds of the tea shrub and of the other new plants which I had discovered, and I did not think the state of the case so urgent as to force me to the unworthy measure of leaving the other man behind and the boatman unpaid. "This plan of yours will not do," said I. "If you can leave the boat in an open manner, taking your companion along with you, and paying all charges, I have no objection either to go on shore or to hire another boat. But I cannot consent to go away in the manner you propose." I was very glad afterwards that I was firm enough to pursue this course. A day or two after this, I was informed in the morning that we were within 30 li of the town of Twinshi, and that we should arrive there in the evening. This was the destination of our boat, and here we should leave it. In the afternoon, about 2 o'clock, we were only 4 miles distant from this place, and as the water was very shallow, and we were making but little progress, most of the passengers determined to walk onwards to the town. We all began to pack up our luggage and make preparations for the journey. The opium smoker, who, with all his civility, was a man I could not trust, was now very anxious to know to what part of the country we were bound. My Chinese servants, who had learned a little wit by experience, took good care to keep all these matters to themselves, their great object being to cut off all connection between their friends in the boat and those with whom we might have to associate afterwards. Our passage money was now fully paid up, our luggage packed, and an arrangement made between my 2 men with regard to the station to which we were bound. When this was all arranged, I left the coolie in charge of the luggage, took Wang on shore, and walked onwards towards Twinshi, which we reached between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It is a thriving, busy town, and forms, as it were, the port of Huizhou, from which it is distant about 20 miles. All the large Hangzhou and Yenzhou boats are moored and loaded here, the river being too shallow to allow of their proceeding higher up, and hence it is a place of great trade. Nearly all the green teas which are sent down the river to Hangzhou and thence onward to Shanghai are shipped at this place. The green teas destined for Canton are carried across a range of hills to the westward, where there is a river which flows in the direction of the Poyang Lake. This part of the country is very populous. Nearly the whole way from the place where we had left our boat was covered with houses, forming a kind of suburb of Twinshi. This place itself is supposed to contain about 150,000 inhabitants. The great article of trade is green tea. There are here a number of large dealers who buy this article from the farmers and priests, refine it and sort it, form it into chops, and forward it to Shanghai or Canton, where it is sold to the foreign merchant. 700 or 800 chops are said to be sent out of this town annually. I observed also a great number of carpenters' shops for the manufacture of chests, a trade which of itself must employ a large number of men. In fact, this town and the surrounding populous district may be said to be supported by the foreign tea trade. Nearly all the way from Yenzhou, the river was bounded by high hills on each side. Now, however, they seemed, as it were, to fall back, and left an extensive and beautiful valley, through the middle of which the river flowed. Nearly all this low land is under tea cultivation. The soil is rich and fertile, and the bushes consequently grow most luxuriantly. I had never before seen the tea plant in such a flourishing condition, and this convinced me that soil had much to do with the superiority of the Huizhou green teas. After spending about an hour in the town, we inquired where we could hire a chair to take us onward about 30 li further, and were directed to an inn or tea house where chairs are let on hire. A circumstance happened in this inn which gave me some amusement at the time, and which I have often laughed at since. When we entered this house, we found a great number of travelers of all ranks. Some were drinking tea, others smoking, and the remainder stretched upon chairs or tables, sound asleep. Seeing strangers arrive, some of the more restless were rather inquisitive, and began to put a number of questions to us. My man Wang was a native of this district and, of course, understood the dialect perfectly, but he evidently wanted to have as little to say as possible. As for myself, I told him I did not understand what they said. One fellow in particular, who probably was sharp enough to detect something unusual in my appearance, was determined not to be put off in this way, and kept asking me a variety of questions. At length, the old innkeeper came up and said with the utmost gravity, "It is of no use your talking to this person. He understands the Guanhua only. You do not speak that, and of course, he cannot understand you, nor you him." This seemed to be perfectly satisfactory to all parties, and I was left unmolested. Our chairs being ready, we got into them and, passing through the town, crossed the river and took the road for Sun Lo and Xiaoning. We reached our destination a little before dark, and I had the first view of the far-famed Sun Lo Shan, the hill where green tea is said to have been first discovered. The hill of Sun Lo, or Sun Lo Shan, is situated in the province of Jiangnan and the district of Xiaoning. It is famous in China as being the place where the green tea shrub was first discovered and where green tea was first manufactured. In a book called The Xiaoning Chai, published A.D. 1693 and quoted by Mr. Ball, there is the following notice of this place, quote, "The hill or mountain where tea is produced is Sun Lo Mountain. A bonze of the sect of Fo taught a Jiangnan man named Ko Tai the art of making tea, and thus it was called Sun Lo tea. The tea got speedily into great repute, so that the bonze became rich and abandoned the profession of priest. The man is gone, and only the name remains. Ye men of learning and travelers who seek Sun Lo tea may now search in vain. That which is sold in the markets is a mere counterfeit." End quote. Sun Lo Shan appears to be between 2,000 and 3,000 feet above the level of the plains. It is very barren, and whatever may have formerly been the case, it certainly produces but little tea now. Indeed, from all I could learn, the tea that grows upon it is quite neglected as far as cultivation is concerned, and is only gathered to supply the wants of the priests of Fo, who have many temples against these rugged wilds. Nevertheless, it is a place of great interest to every Chinaman, and has afforded a subject to many of their writers. The lowlands of this district and those of Muyuan, situated a few miles further south, produce the greater part of the fine green teas of commerce. Hence the distinction betwixt hill tea and garden tea, the latter simply applying to those teas which are carefully cultivated in the plains. The soil here is a rich loam, not unlike the cotton soil of Shanghai, but more free in its texture, being mixed with a considerable portion of sand. In the green tea district of Huizhou, and I believe in all other parts where the shrub is cultivated, it is multiplied by seeds. The seeds are ripe in the month of October. When gathered, they are generally put into a basket and mixed up with sand and earth in a damp state. And in this condition, they are kept until spring. If this plan is not pursued, only a small portion of them will germinate. Like the seeds of the oak and chestnut, they are destroyed when exposed to sudden changes in temperature and moisture. In the month of March, the seeds are taken out of the basket and placed in the ground. They are generally sown thickly in rows or in beds in a nursery or in some spare corner of the tea farm. And sometimes the vacancies in the existing plantations are made up by sowing 5 or 6 seeds in each vacant space. When the young plants are a year old, they are in a fit state for transplanting. This is always done at the change of the monsoon in spring, when fine, warm showers are of frequent occurrence. They are planted in rows about 4 feet apart and in groups of 5 or 6 plants in the row. The distance between each plant or patch is generally about 4 feet. The first crop of leaves is taken from these plants in the 3rd year. When under cultivation, they rarely attain a greater height than 3 or 4 feet. When the winters are very severe, the natives tie straw bands around the bushes to protect them from the frost and to prevent it and the snow from splitting them. In my former work, 3 years' wanderings in the northern provinces of China, I offered some remarks upon the preference which many persons in Europe and America have for colored green teas, and I will now give a full and particular account of the coloring process as practiced in the Huizhou green tea country upon those teas which are destined for the foreign market. 2 kinds of Prussian blue are used by the tea manufacturers. One is the kind commonly met with, and the others I have seen only in the north of China. I formerly mistook this for a kind of indigo. It is less heavy than common Prussian blue, of a bright, pale tint, and very beautiful. Turmeric root is frequently employed in Canton, but I did not observe it in use in Huizhou. I procured samples of these ingredients from the Chinamen in the factory in order that there might be no mistake as to what they really were. These were sent home to the Great Exhibition last year, and a portion of them submitted to Mr. Warrington of Apothecaries Hall, whose investigations in connection with this subject are well known. In a paper read by him before the Chemical Society and published in its Memoirs and Proceedings, he says, quote, Mr. Fortune has forwarded from the north of China for the industrial exhibition specimens of these materials, tea dyes, which, from their appearance, there can be no hesitation in stating, are fibrous gypsum, turmeric root, and Prussian blue. After this digression on the green tea shrub and the country where it was first found, I now resume the account of my travels. When we reached the Sun Lo country, I took up my quarters in a house which belonged to the father of my servant Wang. It was nearly dark before we arrived at the house, which was situated amongst the hills within 2 miles of the foot of Sun Lo. Had I fixed upon the spot myself, I could not have found one better suited to the purposes I had in view. Old Mr. Wang was a farmer who at one time had been well off in the world, but, like many others, had been unfortunate and was now very much reduced in circumstances. He received us in the kindest manner and seemed to have great affection for his son. His wife also came to welcome us, at the same time apologizing for the poor reception they gave us, as they were so poor. I tried not to be outdone in politeness, and we were soon on the best possible terms. The table was soon spread with our evening meal, and, chopsticks in hand, we went to work and did ample justice to the fare set before us. Shortly afterwards, the Chinese, being early in their habits, we retired to rest. Next morning the rain was falling in torrents, so that it was impossible to stir out of doors. In these circumstances, a Chinese cottage is a most uncomfortable place of confinement. 4 families resided in the building in which I was now located, 2 in the lower and 2 in the upper story. Each of these families had a separate kitchen, and, as there were no chimneys, the smoke had to make its escape through the doors, windows, and roof of the house. The natives were accustomed to this and did not greatly mind it, but to me it was almost insupportable. The smoke got into my eyes and almost drove me mad with pain. Go where I would, it was all the same, for the house was quite full of it. I quite dreaded the approach of mealtime, when all the fires were lighted. There was no remedy, however, except going out into the heavy rain, so that I was obliged to suffer as patiently as I could. On the evening of the second day, my coolie and the good old dwarf arrived with my luggage and told Wang some wonderful stories about the narrow escapes they had had from his friends the boatmen. The coolie said he had been so much alarmed that he had spent the whole night in a temple, it being the only place where he considered himself safe. It was not necessary for me to believe all these things, more particularly as all the luggage had come safely to hand, which could scarcely have been the case had the boatmen been as bad as was represented. For 3 days the rain fell incessantly, and was also very cold. The Chinese tried to keep themselves warm by putting on thick clothing, and, strange to say, by reading aloud, which they did in a loud, singing manner, repeating the words as fast as they could. When tired with this way of amusing themselves, nearly the whole of them went to bed, as being the most comfortable place under the circumstances, and strongly recommended me to follow their example. Sun Lo Mountain, which in ordinary weather I could have seen from the windows, was now enveloped in a cloak of mist, and every tree and bush was bent down with heavy drops of rain. At last, on the 4th day, the clouds cleared away, the sun shone out again with its usual brilliancy, and the whole face of nature wore a cheerful and smiling aspect. I was now out every day from morning until evening, busily employed in collecting seeds, in examining the vegetation of the hills, and in obtaining information regarding the cultivation and manufacture of green tea. By this means I obtained a good collection of those tea seeds and young plants from which the finest green teas of commerce are prepared, and much information of a useful kind, which I have endeavored in the last chapter to lay before the reader. In the meantime, I had not lost sight of the beautiful new berberis, which I have already described and which I was most anxious to procure in order to introduce it into Europe. I had frequently desired Wang to endeavor to procure me some young plants of it from some garden in the neighborhood, as I could not believe it to be so rare as to only exist in the old place where I had first seen it. However, he could not find it, or, what was more probable, he gave himself no trouble about the matter. Knowing the potent influence of dollars, I called 3 or 4 of the family around me one morning, and showing them the leaf which I had brought with me, promised $1 to any one of them who would bring me a small plant of the same shrub. One of them went out immediately, and to my surprise and pleasure, returned in less than 5 minutes with a fresh leaf of the plant in question. "That will do," said I. "That is just the thing I want. Bring me a young plant with good roots, and I will give you the promised reward." They now held a consultation amongst themselves in an undertone, and at last said that the plant in question had some peculiar medical virtues, and that the lucky possessor would not part with it. "Sell me this one," said I, "and you will be able to buy a dozen others with the money." "No," one of them replied. "My uncle, in whose garden it is growing, does not want money. He's rich enough, but he requires a little of the plant now and then when he is unwell, and therefore he will not part with it." This was very provoking, but the Chinese were firm, and there was nothing for it but to go, as sailors say, upon another tack. This I determined to do. "Well, at all events," said I, "let me see the plant. Don't be afraid, I shall not touch it." For some time they refused to do even this, but through Wang's influence they were at last induced to consent and led the way down to a small cottage garden, completely covered with weeds. There the beautiful shrub was growing, apparently neglected and left to bloom unseen. It seemed very valuable in the uncle's estimation, and he would not part with it, although I tried hard to induce him to do so. It might be that he really valued its medicinal properties, but as it must be common enough in that part of the country, he could easily have replaced it. It was not unlikely, therefore, that he supposed I should offer some very large sum to induce him to part with it. On the following day, another relation of Wang's came to me in a secret manner, and informed me that he was acquainted with another place where the same plant was to be had, and that for a consideration he would go and fetch some of it for me. I engaged him at once, merely telling him that he must bring young plants with good roots, otherwise they would be entirely useless to me. This he faithfully promised to do, and he kept his word. In the course of the day, he returned with 3 good plants, which he sold to me, and which I afterwards took back to Shanghai. These are now safely in England. I spent a week in the neighborhood of Sun Lo, and then began to think of returning eastward with the collections I made. My coolie was now giving Wang no little annoyance, in the hope of extorting money from him. The coolie had observed how he had been frightened by the boatmen, and doubtless thought that he too might make something out of his timidity. But Wang was now in his father's house, and consequently more bold. He refused to be squeezed to the amount of $4, a sum which the other fellow demanded. The latter, after a great deal of blustering language, left the house with the threat of bringing some countrymen of his own to force compliance with his demands. He returned, however, in the course of an hour, without any companions, and the subject having been mentioned to me in the meantime, I sent for him and threatened to punish him by withholding his wages if I heard any more of the matter. After this, he became more quiet, and I believe the matter was finally arranged by his accepting a loan. In the meantime, old Mr. Wang, in whose house we were staying, having occasion to go down to Twinshi on business, was desired by me to engage a boat to take us down the river again as far as a place called Ningbo. He returned in due time and brought a chop which had been entered into with the boatmen. I could not read the Chinese language, and therefore had to get Wang to read the chop over to me and explain it, more particularly that part which specified the sum I was to pay. The chop stated where we were to be taken to, the number of men we were to have in the boat, the charges for good rice, which they were to supply 3 times a day, and the hire of the boat. With regard to the last item, Wang informed me that it stated I was to pay the sum of $24, part before we started and the remainder at the end of the journey. The sum which I had brought with me was reduced to about $30. I had been obliged to pay very high prices for everything during the journey, and felt convinced that the Chinese system of squeezing had been in full operation. Up to the present time, I had submitted to it with a good grace, knowing that this was the only way to which I was likely to attain the object I had in view. But now it was absolutely necessary for me to rebel. The place to which we were to be taken by this boat was at least 100 miles from any of the ports where the English resided, and where money could be procured, and I had every reason to expect that a sum equal to this would be demanded for taking me on from Ningbo to Ningbo, and this latter demand I should not have been able to pay. Besides, I knew very well, or at least I had every reason to suspect, that the sum stated to me by Wang was much more than his father had agreed for with the boatmen. I therefore said to him that I was quite sure the chop was not correct, and that, whether it was or not, I could not pay such a large sum and must devise some other means of proceeding down the country. He pretended to be highly indignant at even my suspecting his veracity, and was entering into a long explanation when I cut the matter short by saying that my mind was made up upon the subject, and that, as the sum he named was out of the question, I should endeavor to engage another boat myself, or through the coolie. Moreover, I hinted that, if things could not be managed in that way, I would call upon the mandarin of Twinshi and ask his assistance to enable me to engage a boat at a fair and proper price. I then desired him to say no more to me on this subject and walked away. This treatment produced exactly the effect which I intended it should do, and in a few minutes old Wang returned and coolly asked me what sum I was willing to give for the hire of the boat. "What is the use of your asking that question?" I replied. "If you tell me you have engaged a boat at $24, if I take the boat, I must of course pay this sum. If not, I only forfeit the bargain money, which you said you have paid." "Never mind that," said he. "Tell me what sum you could give for the hire of this boat, and then we shall see whether it is sufficient or not." "Well," said I must reach Ningbo for $24, and I know that sum is quite sufficient for the journey. "Very well," he replied with the greatest coolness. "Give me 15 for this boat from Twinshi to Ningbo, and I will guarantee that the other 5 shall take you on to Ningbo." This was agreed to on my part, and the business was apparently arranged to Mr. Wang's satisfaction, and no wonder, for having kept the chop, which I afterwards got translated at Ningbo, I found that $5 instead of 24 was the sum charged for the boat to Ningbo, so that the Wangs had, after all, made 10 by the transaction. Such is the character of the Chinese. They have no idea of telling the truth unless it suits their interests to do so. In fact, I used to often think that they rather preferred lying unless it was against their interests. All our arrangements being complete, the seeds put up and the plants packed, I hired a chair, and on the afternoon of the 20th of November, bade adieu to Wang's family and to the country of the far-famed Sun Lo Shan. The day was wet and stormy, and I had a most disagreeable ride to Twinshi. Towards evening, the gale increased, and the rain fell in torrents. I had procured some oil paper to protect my feet and knees from the rain, which was blown in upon me in front, and my men who accompanied me also covered themselves with the same material, but it was of little use to us, and long before we reached our destination, we were drenched to the skin. To make matters worse, it became quite dark before we reached Twinshi, and it was with great difficulty that my chair-bearers could keep on the narrow road and prevent themselves from slipping and falling down. Our road led along the high bank of the river, and was rather dangerous to travel on in such a night. Once the foremost man came down, and I was all but blown over the bank into the river. Indeed, had the second man not held on firmly by the chair, I believe I must have fallen over the precipice, chair and all. The lights of the town at last came in sight, and as we entered its narrow streets, I ordered the chairman to set me down and wait until my servants came up. The bearers accordingly stopped in front of a tea-house, into which they entered and called for some refreshment. While they were inside the house, I was looking out for my men, as it was just possible that they might pass us in the dark. In a few minutes, Wang came up to me in a state of great excitement and almost pulled me out of the chair. "Come away, be quick," said he. "Leave the chair where it is and let us hurry onwards." I got out, thinking that something very serious was about to happen, and plunged onwards through the mud and rain. We had not gone many yards when the chairman gave chase, and coming up with us, collared Wang and demanded their fare. "What is the meaning of this proceeding?" said I. "You received money from me to pay these men before we started, and now you want to run off without paying them at all?" "Do not make any noise," he replied. "I will account for the money afterwards, but give me some more now to get rid of these men." I did so, and we then went on. When the chairman left us, I was bringing Wang to task for dishonesty. He then told me that, as he was coming up behind my chair, he had observed another chair, in which there was a great general, closely following mine, and that he suspected that this man had some intentions of seizing us and making us prisoners. We plunged onwards and saw no more of the great general, who was probably all the time thinking much more of getting indoors from the pelting storm than of molesting us. Indeed, I strongly suspected that the whole affair was only a trick of Wang's to get rid of the chair-bearers and to rob them of their money, which ought to have been paid to them on starting. We were now in the town of Twinshi, and having crossed the river by a bridge, soon reached our boat. My bed and all my clothes were soaked with rain, and I spent a most uncomfortable night. Early on the following morning, the boat was pushed out into the stream, and we proceeded rapidly down the river. The storm of the previous night had entirely passed away, and never had I seen a more beautiful morning. The sun shone gaily, the atmosphere was clear and bracing, and everything wore a cheerful and smiling aspect. With little exertion on the part of our crew, we floated rapidly down the stream, passing in a quick succession the woods, towns, and villages which lined its banks. Sometimes, as we looked onwards, our course seemed to be stopped by mountain barriers, but as we approached them, a way opened out, and we glided rapidly through, between the mountains, which frequently rose to a height of at least 3,000 feet. The moon was just past the full, and the scenery by moonlight was striking and grand. Sometimes the moon rose in all her grandeur above the tops of the mountains and threw a flood of mellowed light upon the clear and shining river, which made it appear to sparkle as if covered with 1,000 bright gems. Again, as we approached the eastern shore, the moon appeared to sink behind the mountains and set where she rose, and we were left in the shade. And so, as we floated onwards, she rose and set many times until she was so high in the sky that the mountains could no longer intercept her rays. The river being rapid and in many parts studded with rocks and large stones most dangerous to navigation, we were often obliged, when evening came, to drive a bamboo pole into the bank and fasten our boat up for the night. On one occasion, a sudden change of weather took place, an event common amongst these mountains. When we went to bed, the evening was calm and serene, and there was no appearance of any change in the weather. Before midnight, however, 2 or 3 sudden gusts of wind followed each other in quick succession, and in the short space of a quarter of an hour it was blowing a gale. I was awakened by a sudden gust which blew the door open and then nearly swept the roof off. At the same time, the boat was torn from her moorings and driven out into the stream. We were now in a dangerous position, for this part of the river was full of rocks. All the men were up, and with 2 large sculls and bamboo poles tried to get the boat inshore. Some of them were lashing the roof firmly down to the hull with ropes, and I thought it would have been carried away before it could have been secured. Chinamen-like, our crew were making a great noise. All were giving orders and none obeying them. In the meantime, we were flying down before the wind, and with a rapid current. I expected every moment that the boat would strike upon the rocks and be dashed to pieces. Luckily, however, they managed to get her ashore and ran upon a bank of sand, where she was made fast again. At daylight, the wind had abated considerably, but it still blew too strong for us to get under way. We were therefore obliged to remain where we were during the greater part of the day. Our boatmen invited some of their friends, who were detained by the same cause as ourselves, to come on board to dine and play cards, and in this way they amused themselves until the afternoon, when the weather had moderated and we proceeded on our voyage. In 3 days we arrived at the city of Yenzhou, a journey which occupied 12 days in going up, and in 3 days more, that is, on the 6th day after leaving Twinshi, we arrived at the town of Ningbo. Ningbo is a small but busy town, a few miles higher up the river than the city of Hangzhou. It is a place of some importance, as it stands on the main road between Huizhou and Ningbo. Large numbers of riverboats were at anchor abreast of the town, some from Huizhou, Yenzhou, and the other towns up the river, and many from the city of Hangzhou. I suppose the population of the town and boats may amount to 20 or 30,000. I had frequently heard of the rapidity of the tides in the river, but had never seen anything remarkable about them until this evening. We were all seated at dinner, or rather supper, for it was the 3rd and last meal of the day, when I heard a rush of water and a great noise amongst the boats with which we were moored. "Jiangshui, Jiangshui!" exclaimed 100 voices, and 2 or 3 of our men jumped up and ran out to guide the boat. I went out also to see what was going on and observed a large wave coming rolling up towards us. Taking boat after boat in its progress, it whirled it round in an instant until the whole fleet were riding the flood. I can only compare the scene to that presented by some highland river which, swelled after a storm by many mountain streams, came rolling down to the lowlands, flooding the country in its course and bearing everything before it. Having discharged our Huizhou boat, we proceeded through the town to the terminus of a small canal, where another boat was engaged to take us on to a town called Shangyu, or Cao'e, a place not very far from the source of the Ningbo River. The canal was narrow and led us through a beautiful hilly country. All the lowland was evidently very wet and only fit for the cultivation of rice and vegetables. A few miles below Ningbo, we passed a small town where there are government salt warehouses. About this part of the canal, boats are not allowed to go on by night, in order, I suppose, to prevent smuggling. We were therefore stopped about 9 o'clock in the evening and informed that we must not proceed until daylight. I thought this was quite settled when Wang came and asked me whether I wanted to go on or not. He said if I wished to proceed, it was only necessary to pay the soldier who had stopped us about 20 cash, or 1 penny, and then I might do as I pleased. This is the way these things are managed in China. We, of course, paid the cash and went on. Next morning, we arrived at a town of considerable size named Shaoxing. It seems densely populated and probably contains nearly as many inhabitants as Shanghai, about 270,000. The city is walled and fortified in the same manner as all other places of this class. The canal passes around the city walls and forms a sort of moat. A branch of it goes straight through the city itself. Being anxious to visit this place, I directed my boatmen to go through the city, and we entered it by an arch in the ramparts. The walls of Shaoxing are between 3 and 4 miles in circumference, but like most Chinese cities, the space enclosed is not all built over. On the sides of the canal, the houses have a somewhat mean and poor appearance, but they are better in other parts of the town. A great trade seems to be carried on in all the common necessaries of life, and as the town is, as it were, a halfway station between Hangzhou and Ningbo, it is visited by a great number of travelers. A considerable quantity of tea is grown on the hills not far from here. It is, I believe, of a very fair quality, and second only to that of Huizhou. Amongst the sights here, which the Chinese point out and are proud of, is a fine Buddhist temple standing on a pretty little hill just outside the city walls. I saw many ornamental gates in the town, erected to the memory of virtuous women who, judging from the number of these structures, must have been unusually numerous in the place. But its chief fame results from the number of literary men which it has produced, and who are scattered over the whole of the empire. Wherever you meet them, it is their pride and boast to have received their education in the city of Shaoxing. The surrounding country here is flat, and in every direction intersected by canals. The hills, which are seen at no great distance, have a barren appearance. At least they are far from being so fertile as those in the green tea country from which I had just come. Rice appeared to be the staple production, as it is on all low wetlands in this part of China. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we arrived at the town of Caoe. Here we left the Ningbo boat and walked about a mile across the country to another small town named Pakuan. This town stands on the banks of a river which falls into the Bay of Hangzhou. When I first saw this river, I imagined it to be the one which flows down to the city of Ningbo, but I soon found that this was not the case. Pakuan is a long, straggling town full of pack houses, eating houses, and tea shops for the accommodation of travelers and their goods. I found that several foreigners had been here before, and consequently the inhabitants were well acquainted with their features. I was recognized as a foreigner immediately on my entering the town, but was most civilly treated and had no difficulty in engaging a boat to take me onwards. For this purpose I entered the Hongle, or boat inn, and procured a chop, by which the innkeeper bound himself to send me on to Ningbo for the sum of $3. During the night we passed over 2 embankments, which for small vessels answer the same purposes as the locks on our canals at home. This mode of getting from a higher to a lower level, or vice versa, is common in China, where locks, such as those seen in Europe, do not seem to be used. As our boat glided swiftly down the inclined plane at midnight amidst the lanterns of the Chinese, the effect was curious enough to a person like myself who had never seen anything of the kind before. The second launch brought us upon the waters of the Ningbo River. During the night, we passed a large city named Yuyao, and next morning I found we were sailing down a wide and beautiful stream, which I knew passed the city of Ningbo and entered the sea at Zhenhai. Nothing worthy of note occurred until I reached the town of Ningbo. It was as welcome a sight as I had seen for many a day when the old town, with its pagoda, temples, and ramparts, came in view. It was well known to me in former years, and I felt myself quite at home after a long and somewhat perilous, although in many respects, a pleasant journey. Okay, he makes it back to Ningbo safe and sound, and he's carrying a nice load of green tea seeds, plant specimens, and all kinds of cuttings he picked up along the way. Did you hear the part where there's this huge rush of water and someone yells out, "Zhang Shui, Zhang Shui"? What Fortune was witnessing was one of the famous tidal bores of those rivers. Zhang Shui means just that. The water is rising. This natural wonder still delights and amuses people to this day. Fortune got to kick back in the vicinity of Sun Lo Shan, Sun Lo Mountain, famous throughout the tea-drinking world for its tea and its reputation as the place where tea cultivation supposedly began. This was not exactly true, but not everyone in the West knew that yet. He quoted from a Mr. Ball. I was terribly curious who this might be. And just in case you were too, I looked into this, and I think I was able to track down this authority who, in his writings, read by Fortune, gave the lowdown on the fall of Sun Lo Mountain as a place for tea cultivation. There was a Dr. Dyer Ball, 1796 to 1866, an American physician and missionary from West Boylston, Massachusetts. He learned Chinese in America and went to China via Singapore and did all kinds of missionary and medical work there, and later ended up in Canton, where he later died. Dr. Ball was interred there in a cemetery that no longer exists. By all accounts, he lived quite an extraordinary life, as did all these writers I'm going to introduce to you. They all lived a very long time ago, and I'm going to excavate their lost or forgotten China travel writing and bring them to you. That's the whole purpose of the China Vintage Hour. I'm sparing you the brunt of Robert Fortune's botanical observations. He was a trained botanist and expert in everything of a horticultural nature. He lays it on thick with his observations of trees, bushes, flowers, and all manners of flora. I'm editing out most of these details. Hope you don't mind. Maybe next episode we'll take a break from Robert Fortune and circle back maybe another day. I'll pick out something nice for next time. Don't worry. Until then, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the movie capital of the world. I think it still is. Los Angeles, California. You're most welcome to go check out our sister and brother podcast, the China History Podcast, and the Chinese Sayings Podcast. All free, all the time. Take care, my beloved and treasured listeners. I'd love to see you again next time, so please consider coming back for another old-fashioned episode from the China Vintage Hour.